Hello learners, I am SAHABIDDIN AHMAD, Assistant Professor, Guest, Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Chhattisgarh, Bilaspur. Welcome you all to this virtual lecture. Today, now, I am going to discuss William Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. I hope you are all feeling ready for an engaging journey into the world of literature. Now today we have the privilege of exploring one of the foundational texts in the history of literary criticism that helps us understand the nature, scope and function of poetry that is distinct from neoclassical poetry, and the creative process of poetry and the role of the poet in depicting universal human nature, human condition and profound human truths, and the role of the reader in the reception and the interpretation of poetry. So Wordsworth's preface is seen as a romantic manifesto in British literature, and his preface explains the aims and goals of romanticism, and his preface gives a new direction to British romanticism, and his preface seeks to bring about a revolution in poetic diction, poetic truth and poetic taste. And Wordsworth's work provides a critical insight into the nature of poetic truth, that is higher and nobler kind of poetic pleasure, and his preface offers a framework for understanding the mechanics of poetry, a framework that has influenced romantic literary theory, especially romantic poetry. So Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads serves as a cornerstone in the study of poetry because it enriches our appreciation of poetry, and it helps us critically analyze poetry from expressive perspective, and it highlights poetry's enormous socio-cultural, moral, psychological importance in our lives. Now I would like to give you a biographical background information about the author of this work. So now I am discussing William Wordsworth's biographical background. William Wordsworth was an English romantic poet and critic, and William Wordsworth was influenced by the promises of the French Revolution, that is the liberty, equality and fraternity. And like other romantics, Wordsworth also believed in humanity's limitless aspirations, limitless aims towards infinite good and imperfection. Even though one finds himself or herself in failure, and he opposed the limited aims, finite human aspirations and rigid norms, rigid rules that are associated with the neoclassical philosophy. So Lyrical Ballads with a few other poems are jointly written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Lyrical Ballads was first published in 1798, and its second edition with a preface was published by William Wordsworth, that was published in 1800, and its third and fourth edition were published later in 1802 and 1805 respectively. Now I am going to delve into William Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. So I am going to delve into the aims and purpose and themes of the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. William Wordsworth's preface was published in 1800, and his preface was seen as the manifesto of romantic movement in literature, and his preface was written as a poetic manifesto in which William Wordsworth rejected the artificialities of the tradition, subject matter, style of the neoclassical period, and he added the preface to the earlier edition, Lyrical Ballads, only to announce a new kind of poetry, a new kind of subject matter and style. So he re-evaluated earlier poetry so that his poetry and poetic philosophy, poetic thoughts may be appreciated, established. That's why he did this work. So in the preface, William Wordsworth deals with the subject matter that he has taken from the incidents and situations from common life, ordinary life and ordinary language spoken by ordinary men, because he thought that the incidents from rural life, ordinary life have an affinity with the primary laws of nature, and his treatment of ordinary life or lower class subjects and common language violated the neoclassical rules of decorum, which is associated with rigorous rigidity, region, artificiality, that are associated with the upper class characters, elevated style. So neoclassical decorum stressed that strict application of literary rules and conventions are more important in dealing with subject matters, characters, action, events, style, emotional effect. For instance, tragedy must not be mixed with comedy. Epic and tragedy should be written in a high style, and their subject matters will be highest social classes and in grand style. Like other romantics, William Wordsworth denounced these criteria because these writers imitated the Roman and Greek writers as their models in the representations of subject matter, forms, style, decorum. And for neoclassical writers, art and literature were remarkable for their artifice, artificiality and grand style. So William Wordsworth's poetic manifesto favored experiments over traditionalism in subject matter, style, actions, forms, and his preface violated the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many contemporary poets. For example, Thomas Gray, who attempted to separate the language of poetry as far as possible from that of real life. So that's why William Wordsworth objected to the vagueness, glossy and obscure language, ornate language which separates the subject matters of poetry from ordinary events, ordinary life that happens in actually real life. So according to William Wordsworth, the great value of poetry lies in the sharing of experience and the communication of truths carried alive into the heart by passion that he found in ordinary situations, ordinary characters, common life. That's why he proposed instead to fit material arrangement, poetic diction into a selection of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation, emotional affinity. So William Wordsworth sets up a romantic value in his poetry, in which the rural life is valued over the urban. According to him, nature is better than culture, and the simple rural people are closer to nature than the educated aristocratic people and gentility. So that's why he stressed on emotion and simplicity, pleasure as a subject matter in his poetry. And William Wordsworth is not interested in the moral effect of poetry, but he was interested in the exalted pleasure in poetry that results from the increased nobler kind of knowledge. So William Wordsworth is more concerned with the relation between the poet and the poem rather than the relationship between poem and its reader. And according to him, a poem is not the product of reason, but poem is a product of the expressions of the powerful feelings. So poem is an authentic expression of feelings, emotions that are generated in a natural setting, settings, common life. And to him, feeling is more important than reason, action, character, mimetic accuracy. So feeling and emotions are integral part of poetry, and they are more important than logic, reason. The intellect can only grasp nature in pieces, while the imagination grasps it in its entirety. According to Wordsworth, the poet certain kinds of power because he feels things more powerfully than average person, and poet has an ability to express those feelings not because of education or training, but because of an inborn quality, inborn innate ability that sets the poet apart from the rest of the humanity. So here lies the difference between the poet and other ordinary men. Now let us move on to William Wordsworth's theory of poetry, the process of poetic creation. So he defines poetry. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry should not be taken too literally. Poetry is a rapid flow of emotion, thoughts, expression, and should be taken in a context of intense mental and emotional activity. The essential component of poetry, according to William Wordsworth, is the poet's own feelings, perceptions, thoughts, inner ideas. So the feelings therein developed gives importance to the action and situation, and not the action and situation to the feelings. Unquote. So there are 4 stages according to William Wordsworth for the process of the poetic creation. The process of poetic composition is spontaneous as opposed to the strict principles of decorum and mimesis of the neoclassical period. So according to him, the first stage is emotions recollected in tranquility. In this stage, the process begins in a state of calm with the remembering of some past incidents, past experiences, emotional experiences. And secondly, he specifies that a poet's spontaneity is the result of a previous process of deep sensibility and reflection. And thirdly, William Wordsworth makes it clear that it may be the previous emotions and thoughts experience may be followed by the second thoughts or revision with a difference. The present emotions are modified by thoughts and related to the past thoughts and feelings. That's why there would be an amalgamation of multiple thoughts and emotions. So finally, the creative process is the process of combination, recombination, amalgamation, contemplation, evaluation, re-evaluation, interaction of conscious and unconscious thoughts, emotion, feelings, until the poetry is made through the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, until the creative process is in the form of poem. So I have discussed the process of poetic creation. Now I am moving on to what is a poet. According to William Wordsworth, poet is a man who has possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, and poet is one who has thought long and deeply. Unquote. And William Wordsworth defines poet, that poet is a man speaking to men. Poet is a man, it is true, poet is endowed with more lively sensibility. Poet is endowed with more enthusiasm and tenderness, and poet has greater knowledge of human nature. poet has a more comprehensive soul than other ordinary human beings. That's why there is a great difference between poet and other person. And poets rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, delighting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe. And that's why poet portrays human nature, profound human truths, human conditions that only poet can do. And he emphasizes that the poet is a man of greater power of communication, reflection, observation, sensibility, and poet has the power of imagination in exposing what he feels, what he views. And the poet's only duty is to produce and give immediate pleasure as a man. And it is an acknowledgement of the beauty of the universe. It is an acknowledgement of the complexities of the human lives. So it is a homage paid to the native and naked dignity of man. So for Wordsworth, the poet's speciality is the interaction between man and his environment, and the complexities of pleasure and pain, and the deep sympathies by which they are interrelated. So it is only poet who can depict such themes. So there is sanctity and truth about the poet's descriptions of these things. So there is the only difference between poet and other men is a difference of degree. The poet has a greater promptness and power in expressing general human nature, human feelings, human thoughts, passion, emotion of men. So rather than merely imitating nature, guided by the neoclassical rules, the poet is a human being whose speciality is humanity. He is a man whose focus is upon man and not in rigid laws, not in society but in human nature. And poet's function is not limited to recording, however faithfully, sympathetically. Poet's only duty is to reflect the feelings, complexities of human nature. So that is all about the role of the ideal poet that I have discussed. Now I am turning our attention to William Wordsworth's views on the subject of poetry. As I have already discussed it in the section Aims and Goals of the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. Again I am repeating, William Wordsworth chosen his subject from humble and rustic life as his subject of his poetry because he thinks that the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in such a humble and rustic life, in which they can attain maturity free of artificiality and gaudiness of phraseology. So he speaks a plainer and more emphatic language spoken by ordinary men, and his viewpoints on such life demands an expression of human passions and human values which are preoccupied with human emotions, free of artificiality, free of the subject matter of upper classes. So his preface shows an attempt to shift in literary perspective away from artificiality and false sophistication of the preceding century. So it shows how a sophisticated diction alienates natural human sympathy, and simple rural people are less restrained, less artificial in their feelings and in their emotions, and that's why those feelings are more in touch with the common human common environment. That's why he focuses on the everyday language of ordinary man, human interaction with the natural world and their affinity with naturalness. Now I would like to turn to William Wordsworth's views on poetic diction and poetic style. William Wordsworth rejected poetic diction used by his contemporary poets in favor of the very language of ordinary men. And William Wordsworth was advocating the need for the romantic type of poetic diction that he sought to establish, revolutionize in his poetry. And he asserted that how the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is different from the artificiality of the aristocratic classes, and he adapted the poetic pleasures as he has taken his subject matter from ordinary life. And he discussed the gaudiness and inane phraseology of contemporary poets, and his poems contain little poetic diction. I am quoting his lines: "There neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and the metrical composition that is poetry." Unquote. So William Wordsworth finds that prose and poetry emerge out of the same source of the human mind. They are closely akin in their nature, function and appeal. So meter is not organic to poetry but something external. Meter works as an additional source of pleasure. When the poet speaks through characters, the language used must be appropriate to characters and situation. And over elaborated diction, ornate diction, artificial diction would shock the sensible reader. That's why he states that there is no difference between the language of prose and the metrical composition. According to him, the language of poetry should be as far as a selection of the language really spoken by men. And he puts emphasis on that if the subject is poetry is properly chosen, it will naturally lead the poet to the feelings whose appropriate expression will have dignity, beauty and metaphorical vitality. He appeals to the primitive, naive and directly passionate natural world. So William Wordsworth revolted against the classical poetic diction, poetic truth, and he believed that the language of poetry should not be the artificiality, it should be true to the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, true to the emotion, thoughts, inner ideas of ordinary men. So the language of low and rustic persons is most likely to be poetic because of the presence of these feelings in them. It is because these men convey their feelings and emotions in simple and elaborated expressions. So William Wordsworth speaks in favor of naturalness in expressions in poetry. The main purpose of poetry is to provide a higher kind of poetic pleasure, and poetry gives pleasures because it imitates nature well, and a thing that is well imitated causes a pleasure. So poetry increases our knowledge and understanding of the human nature. Poetry arouses our sympathy with other, and poetry brings inner satisfaction. So poetry makes us perceive the essential identity of man and nature. Here lies the significance of poetry in our social, moral, psychological, intellectual life. So poetry is the most philosophical of all writings. The appeal of science is merely to the intellect. Poetry complements science by adding feelings and emotions to its truth and by its imaginative power, because it makes people more fully aware of them. So in this way, William Wordsworth makes a distinction between poetry and science. The truth of poetry are colored by imagination and emotion, and the appeal of the scientist is only exclusively limited to the intellect, and poet's appeal is unlimited because it appeals to the heart and soul of. So I'd like to look at the faults of William Wordsworth's poetic theory. So because many critics blames William Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads for having its obscurity, propaganda, over elaboration and over exaggeration and over emphasis, misleading ideas and provoking hostility among critics. And in the preface, William Wordsworth's tone is pedantic and sometimes arrogant, and he makes bold claims for his own poems, for his own poetic philosophy, and some important quotes. So that's why critics blamed his preface. Some important quotes are mentioned in this slide for better understanding. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry is the breath and final spirit of all knowledge. I am quoting again. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. It is immortal as the heart of man. Poetry is not a matter of amusement and idle pleasure. Poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. Its objective is truth, not individual and local, but general and operative. Poetry is the image of man and nature. Now I am turning to some questions. Further, some questions are added in this slide to reflect upon. To sum up, William Wordsworth, the preface is a part of the general reaction against the aristocratic side of neoclassicism. His preface is a reaction against neoclassical poetic theory, and his preface is far from being a neat and well-developed apology for spontaneity and naturalness of expression, because his preface contains a few statements which look like attempts to qualify his main view concerning the very language of men, the language of low and rustic life. The moment the poet makes a selection from rustic life, ordinary life, he deviates from the naturalness of expression and becomes artificial. So these are the objections raised by many critics, especially Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And William Wordsworth was wise enough to know that the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings does not make poetry. The poet has to think long and deep. The poet makes ordinary situation interesting only by tracing in them by the laws of human nature as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. So that's why poetry is not true to nature, that William Wordsworth admits, but poetry is a deviation from nature, and poetry makes an apple model of his own argument. However, in the preface, William Wordsworth is stressed on emotion, feelings, simplicity, sensibility, naturalness in his writing, rather than artificiality and unnatural phraseology of the neoclassical poetic thought, poetic diction. And his preface advocates a poetry that turns very simply to nature and the human soul. And here lies his revolutionary thoughts regarding poetic diction, poetic truth, and poetic pleasure. So that's all for today. Now we have completed William Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, and soon we will meet again with another video. Till then, stay happy. Thank you for watching this virtual